My name is Justin, and I am a son of God and an addict, and the host of the RECO12 speaker meeting. And thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts, I'm living the relative happy, joyous, and free life that is promised to those living in recovery and have been very active in the rooms of recovery since September of 2013. Welcome to the 124th meeting of RECO12. We are an organization with the mission of learning and sharing the similarities of addiction of all kinds and the similarities of recovery from all afflictions and addictions, and gaining and sharing tools and hope from others who are trudging this road. We are an open meeting for all, no matter your life experiences, faith traditions, nationality, or background. To learn more about RECO12, please go to www.reco12.com. That's RECO12, like recovery 12 step.com. RECO12 appreciates your help in keeping to us working our 12th step. And wow, let me start that again. RECO12 appreciates your help in keeping us working our 12th step and are grateful to receive donations to cover Zoom and the podcast overhead costs. I'll put the information and links in the chat of the live meeting and also in the show notes of the podcast if you wish to contribute to this cause. Also, if RECO12 is a meaningful tool to you in your own recovery walk, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast in the podcast platform you're using, and also sharing it with your recovery network. We look forward each week to receiving from the light reflected from our speakers from their higher power. That light inspires hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. I'm excited to hear from this week's guest, Jon R, who was a previous guest and addressed Step 7 in the 12-week series we did on the 12 Steps of Recovery. That was meeting number 97 for your reference, if you'd like to go back and listen to it if you haven't already done that. Today, he will be speaking to us on the topic of addressing fear. Now, here's just a little bit about Jon. Jon R struggled with addiction throughout his teenage years and went into residential treatment at the age of 19 for alcohol and drug use. At 28, Jon was diagnosed with advanced stage thyroid cancer in early 2003. As a result of complications from his first surgery, Jon was prescribed oxycontin. Jon's story involves a 14-year struggle with drugs and alcohol, losing his career, and nearly losing his family. He tried using the knowledge from his education to fight this disease, and it wasn't until he turned to a higher power for help that he was able to do that. He is actively involved in AA with his personal recovery. Jon, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Justin. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I'm just checking timing. I want to make sure that I'm cognizant of that, but I will start with just telling you that my name's Jon and I am an alcoholic. I have a sobriety date. My sobriety date is August 24th of 2017. I have a sponsor that I'm current with, and I work with other people and sponsor. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I'm going to take just maybe 10 minutes or so kind of qualifying myself. So I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, currently. I have a home group here. It's the Sunday Night Big Book Study. It's at 7 o'clock, and it's at a place in Bountiful. And if anyone's ever in town, we would absolutely love to have you. It's an amazing meeting because we get into the solution. To qualify, I'm the oldest of 6 kids, was raised in a home that was fairly religious. I say that in a way that I always knew how important the rules were in my house, and what they meant. And it was a lot to feel like I had to live up to. When I was younger, to give you an idea of kind of my personality and the way it was, when I was 6 years old, my parents moved us to France. And when we moved to France, all I knew how to say was "Je m'appelle," which is "my name is," and then Jonathan. And I didn't know how to speak any other French, and I was put in a French-speaking school. And I remember how nervous and anxious I was that morning, even at the age of 6. And one of the interesting things is that nervousness, that anxiety level, that wasn't something that was new to me. I always felt like I was someone who was maybe overthinking this world, always just nervous, trying to figure out how other people fit in so well. Something happened in my life in between 8th and 9th grade. So I was 13, 14 years old, and I had a friend come over, and my friend brought over a couple Smirnoff mini bottles. And that night I learned how to pronounce Smirnoff, because what happened is I drank 3 of them, and I went out in the neighborhood, and it was the first time in my life I could actually remember making eye contact with girls. I felt like the people around me thought I was funny. I felt like I was funny, and I kind of felt like I had arrived. And that was early on at the age of 13. That progressed as it does when somebody who has this disease puts alcohol or drugs in their system. And it wasn't long before I was using hard drugs and injecting. I was an IV heroin and cocaine user at the age of 18. I just had gotten to a bottom so incredibly quick by doing that. And I went into treatment at 19 years old, and I was so open and willing to anything that was suggested and anything that they gave me, because it was a way for me to have a new life. I went in, and then I got a degree in psychology. After that, I went to the graduate school of social work to become a licensed substance abuse counselor. I went to another university and got an MBA. And I tell you this because there's no real career path in that. Like, if you're thinking psychology, social work, MBA, if you ever have a career counselor that tells you to do that, just fire them, because there's no path there. But I was somebody who, my education tells me really 2 things about me, and I say this all the time, but it may tell you the same 2 things. Is I was someone who was so full of fear and so anxious that I stayed in school because it felt safe. I was in school because I knew what was expected out of me, and I knew I could do it. I remember graduating my MBA program and almost having no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I had got married during that time and started a family. A really specific day in my life, which is a huge part of my story, is St. Patrick's Day of 2003. And I had gotten a job in medical cells, and we were moving from Utah down to Las Vegas. I was going to work with doctors and in hospitals. And I got a call that night from the local doctor who I'd just gone to do a checkup with before we were moving. And he said, "John, we got your blood results back." And he said, "Your blood results came back and they were suspicious." And I had no idea what suspicious meant. So I asked him, and he said, "John, what that means is you have cancer. And I'm going to clear my schedule, and I need you to come in tomorrow morning, and I need you to clear yours." And so I went in the next morning. I was 28 years old. My oldest son was getting ready to turn 3 in a month, and my wife was pregnant with twins. And she was 7 months pregnant with twins. And I remember going into that doctor's appointment and asking the doctor what the prognosis was. And he looked at me and he said, "John, you have stage 4 thyroid cancer. Worst case scenario, I'm going to give you about 6 months." And this was in 2003. And I was in his office for maybe another 5 minutes, and I don't remember anything else he said. I remember feeling like I was that little kid day 1 in school in France all over again, feeling like I didn't know what, I had no idea what to do. But I was so full of fear. I was trying to figure out who's going to raise these kids. And I didn't have a way of dealing with it. And so I went in for my first surgery, and they severed a branch of my spinal accessory nerve and put me on oxycontin in 2003 and told me good luck. And for several years, for 3 years, I went into multiple surgeries and radiation and treatment and all these other things, and simply just was living in a way that I felt like I was probably going to be dying here soon, and not really connecting with anybody. And I had my last surgery. It was 3 years after this, up at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And I remember the doctors coming to me and telling me that they had gotten it all and that I was cancer free. And you would assume that would just be the best news ever. But my thought at the time was, oh no, now what am I going to do with my life? I knew I was hooked on pills. I knew I was drinking about a bottle a night to fall asleep, a fifth a night to fall asleep. And I had this great idea, which is, Jon, you've been to school, you've got a master's degree in this. Why don't you pull yourself out of it? And so I spent the next 14 years trying to pull myself out of this disease. And it wasn't until 14 years later, we had moved back up from Las Vegas. And part of the reason we had moved up is I thought that, maybe Vegas was the problem. So we moved back up to Utah. Turns out Vegas wasn't the problem. I had gotten other jobs, and I say gotten other jobs, but I'd also been let go from a lot of jobs in this process because I was such a mess. And we were going on a family vacation, and this is how bad it had gotten for me, is that at one point, my parents and my in-laws had gotten together, and they had tried to figure out if it was possible to put me on permanent disability, because they never thought I'd be able to be a part of this world. They never thought that I would be able to hold a job, that I would be able to be a parent, that I'd be able to just I'd be able to survive. And the worst part about that is I'd gotten to a point where somewhere inside of me, I thought they might be right. And it was the summer of 2017, and the family was going out of town to Newport Beach, California. And I'm somebody who loves Newport. Like, I've been there a few times, and it seems to me like every time I've been to Newport, it's always 85 degrees, but it's the right kind of 85 degrees. It's not the overly humid, overly muggy. You got the breeze coming in off the ocean. You can watch the sunset. And I thought, man, this is going to be amazing. And it was a couple of days before that trip that my wife came to me and let me know I was uninvited. And so I felt like she uninvited me. I've told my story hundreds of times, and she's heard it a lot. And she pulled me aside a couple of years ago and said, dude, you keep telling people you're uninvited. She goes, you were actually never invited to start with. She goes, I just had to tell you. And I thought, well, that's accurate, harsh, but accurate. And so I was home alone, and I was completely out of options. I'd spent 14 years using all the book knowledge and all the self-will and all the self-knowledge I had to try to overcome this disease. And it had only gotten worse. It was one of the things where the harder I worked on it, the worse it became. And the worse it became, the more effort I put into fighting it. And it was just all consuming. And I didn't know what to do. So I went through my house, and I don't know why I locked all the doors. I locked the doors, pulled the blinds. I went to a room in the basement, and went in, sat on a bed, and locked that door. And I just said, God, if there's a way out of this, please help me. And what happened as a result of that prayer, it was a couple of days later, I'd lost my job. They told me not to come in anymore. When my wife and kids came back from Newport, my wife pulled me aside and said, look, man, I'm at a point where I don't care if we stay married or get divorced anymore. You have to leave. And I couldn't get my kids to really make eye contact with me. And then I had a chance to go into treatment. And I'm convinced that if those things wouldn't have happened the way they happened, I wouldn't have gone into a residential treatment center, which is what I needed at the time, that was able to get me started with the life that I have today, which is something I'm so grateful for. That's kind of my way of qualifying. And so I don't want to take too much more time about that, but I was asked to pick a topic. And the topic, I really struggled with trying to figure out a topic. And so I was telling Justin earlier before we went on the air that I had called my sponsor and I had asked him for ideas on a topic. And I had these great ideas of things that I could talk about, like things that I knew and that I felt like I was doing well in my recovery. And he pretty much just said, you can do that, but he said, what's probably going to really help you the most and hopefully help the people that are listening is if you talk about something that you're struggling with and you talk about the tools that you're using to work through it. And so that's why the topic that I selected, and I selected it prayerfully, was addressing fear. And I had spent some time going through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there were a few things that really jumped out to me. These things were really things that just resonated with me. And I was reading, I generally always start in the foreword in the doctor's opinion. And there was a part in the doctor's opinion. And I'll paraphrase this because I guess I do have a book in front of me. I can grab it. But what Dr. Silkworth essentially says is that there comes a time where we can't differentiate the true from the false. And my alcoholic life is going to seem like the only normal one. And I am restless, irritable, and discontent. And I look back at my life and I realize that is how I lived my life. Like I thought this underlying thread of anxiety that I had always suffered from was a normal way to live this life. It was the only way that I had known. I had been diagnosed at an early age with a generalized anxiety disorder. And it wasn't actually till coming to AA that I realized that was fear. I always just thought that's how my life was. I didn't realize that the things that I would get so upset and so concerned about that just seemed normal to me was my inability to cope with some of the fear that was always in front of me. And so I remember going through the book, and I've been through the steps a few times, 4 times, with people and with my sponsor. And I remember all the things that I would have on my fear inventory. And one of the things that jumped out to me, and this is a big one for me, is that in step 3, we talk about how we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. And it talks about in step 3 on page 62 of the book, where it says selfishness and self-centeredness that we think is the root of our trouble. And then it says an interesting thing, because it's a thing I relate to. And it says driven by 100 forms of fear. And then it goes on to say self-seeking and everything else. But fear is the first thing that uses. And so when I read that, I went to the dictionary and I looked up the definition of driven. And one of the definitions of driven is to be controlled. And I'm realizing that in my life, because of my selfishness and self-centeredness, that I personally have been driven by 100 forms of fear, self-seeking, self-pity, all these other things that crop up out of that. And as a result of that, I've stepped on the toes of the people around me and they retaliate. And so I'm living at this constant state of dis-ease, which somebody explained to me that's part of what our disease is. And I'm realizing that I'm restless, irritable, and discontent because of this anxiety, because of these things that are internal with me. And I have to have a solution for that. And so a lot of the fears that I run into are I'm concerned about my kids. I've got a 22-year-old. I've got twins now that are 19. My youngest is 13. And this world is a different place than it was when I was their age, 35 years ago. And I'm watching them go into it, and that causes me some fear. I have fear right now in a new business venture I'm doing, and it is an interesting thing. And I'll talk about this a little later without being specific, but how I'm walking through it. And as we get to further in the book, and the way that I see it in there is I look at the bottom of page 67 where it talks about fear, and it says, It is an evil and corroding thread, and the fabric of my existence is shot through with it. And I realized that fear is something that is just driven me. I used to tell people I would get crippled by anxiety. There were times where I didn't want to leave the house. I thought maybe a good idea of a day would be to just binge Netflix for an entire day. And I've even done that a couple of days in recovery, especially early recovery. And it's interesting. I remember those days because they were quite literally the worst days I've had in recovery. The days where I'm thinking, okay, I'm not going to go out into the world. I'm not going to address it. I'm just going to stay here and get my mind someplace else. And I remember just at the end of those nights thinking, man, that, like, I don't know if there could be anything worse than that. Like the way that I felt after doing that. And so when we go on further in the book, and on page 68, so at 67, it talks about how fear is an evil and corroding thread. And I'm going to go to the book a little bit here. I hope that's okay. Awesome. Thank you. Because that's kind of where my solution is. And it talks about, we reviewed our fears thoroughly and we put them on paper. And I still do that. 5 years sober, I will put them on paper. I will make my columns. I will do an inventory, and then I will call somebody and address it. And what it tells me is we asked ourselves why we had them. Wasn't it because self-reliance had failed us? And self-reliance was good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. And I look at what I had done for 14 years in trying to get out of this disease. I had used kind of every method that I could possibly think of to do it. I had looked at, I joke with people, but it's like honest. I used alcohol to solve my pill problem. I used cocaine to solve my alcohol problem. Like, I just moved from one thing to another thinking, okay, this is now out of control. Why don't you try something you can just focus on? And I didn't realize the unmanageability of my life. And it's an interesting thing, which kind of takes me to step one. And I don't necessarily mean to regress, but I remember 14 years into it, my life, I wasn't happy with it, but it didn't feel all that unmanageable. And the reason why it didn't feel all that unmanageable is because I had all these loving people in my life managing it for me. I had a spouse who was managing it. I had my parents who were managing it. And finally, when they just got to a point like, Jon, this is a disaster and it is now yours. I remember looking at it and thinking, man, this is bad. Like, this is much more unmanageable than I thought it was when I was the one who had to manage it. And so that's what kind of preceded all of that, and preceded the prayer to ask for help, which preceded this whole process. Is it was given to me. And what I realized in that moment, and what I still realize today, is that on my own, I'm not very good at solving these things. I haven't been. I've got a track record going back years and years saying that, hey, whatever good ideas you have and whatever effort you put towards it, you're probably going to be in a bit of trouble. And because for me, it literally only got worse. And so I realized that self-reliance is not, it's going to fail me, that it has, and that at times when I pull it off and I make it work, it actually makes it worse the next time. And then there's one paragraph in the book on page 68, and it is most likely my favorite paragraph. It is one that I think is so important, and I'll explain how I use it in my life today. And it says, perhaps there's a better way. We think so, for we are now on a different basis. We are on the basis of trusting and relying upon God. We can trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. We're in the world to play the role he assigns, and just to the extent that we do as we think he would have us and humbly rely on him, does he enable us to match calamity with serenity. And I used to be somebody who would kind of wait for the fear to go away. Like when something would come up, I'd look to the root of it and I'd see if it was justifiable. And then I'd go through this whole process to actually look at it. And now what I've realized is that I've had things that have happened in my life. I've had like real calamity. Um, my wife's brother passed away from this disease about a year and a half ago, and he drank himself to death. And I remember being in his room packing it up because it was too heavy for his parents, trying to be of service. And he had 3 big books in there that were given to him. None of them were read. And I remember just sitting there sobbing, thinking, man, you've had the answer here the entire time. And that's a calamity that I remember having to walk through. But I walked through it with a sense of peace. I walked through it with serenity because I did not walk through it alone. I have this prayer that I say sometimes, and it's a super simple one. But it is simply, God, they tell me you're not going to give me more than I can handle. But I think you got a little bit too much faith in me because I'm not handling this very well. I could sure use your help. And then I get going. And then I get my feet in motion and I do some work. The other calamity that I find that comes up in my life is the stuff that happens between my ears. I have a tendency to, I've heard this said before and I've taken it, so it's not an original Jon thing, but that I solve the wreckage of my future, that I clean up the wreckage of my future, meaning that I spend so much time in my life thinking through what could happen, what's going to happen, and trying to figure out how to address all of that, where that's not, and all I'm doing is I'm just running with these fears and I'm letting them go. And so I have, when I said I've got some stuff going on in my personal life with work and a few things, I am doing a new business venture, and I feel like there's been a lot that's gone into this, and it's going in a direction that I didn't necessarily think it should go initially when I started it. And so my head's telling me that I might be crazy in this process. But one of the things that is happening here is that I feel so much peace about the path that I'm on that it's just letting me continue to do the work. And so what I used to do is I used to think that I had to wait for the fear to go away to take action. I had to wait for, or to be able to rationalize it or justify it, or, I've done a ton of therapy, so therapize it. Like I'm not somebody who, before recovery was much about being into action. I was more into like discussion, like instead of taking the steps, like, let's just sit and talk about it. Maybe I'll vent to you about it and somehow try to feel better. We're not big on that in 12-step rooms. We're not into theory. We're actually into action. And what I've realized in my life is that when these things come up, my job is to take the action to walk through it. And what happens there for me is that as I walk through it, I realize that the fear itself, once I've walked through it, the fear no longer holds any power. And what happens is I walk through it and I seek the guidance. I'm asking for help constantly. I'm bouncing my great ideas off my sponsor, which is important for me. And I think having a sponsor is very essential. One of the things I get out of having a good sponsor is that I've got somebody who can help me with my life who's not as emotionally involved in it. And I'm pretty emotionally involved in me, in the things that happen in my life, that I find that I don't always make the best decisions. And so the paragraph that follows tells me that, well, I'll paraphrase it a little bit, but what it tells me is that to do this, it's going to take courage. It tells me that men of faith have courage because they trust their God. They say that it says that some people can say that spirituality is a way of weakness, but paradoxically, it is a way of strength. That we tap into something bigger than us, that we go through this process, and in going through this process and walking through it, we walk through it with a sense of peace, with a sense of strength, with the serenity that it talks about on page 68. And then we get to focus our attention on what God would have us be. Interestingly enough, I don't know how, I tell people this, I don't know how to do anything for God that God can't do for God. Sometimes they're like, okay, well, what's your work that you're doing for him? And I'm like, for me, it's just simply trying to help his kids. It's one of the things I pray for in the morning, is giving me an opportunity to be of service to his kids. And what I find is that when I'm able to take me out of it and help one of his kids, suddenly the fear starts going away. Suddenly I realize that the things that I was so concerned about in my life are getting solved, and I don't even need to have a lot of input into it. The thing with fear is it talks about it so much in the book, and it talks about where even in our 12 by 12 uses it a lot. It tells us in step 7 that fear is the chief activator of all of our defects of character. Either we're not going to get something we want, or we're going to lose something we have. And I realized that in my life, I've been driven by it. And what recovery has given me is the opportunity to address it in a different way and not address it alone. That I can trust God. And I'm going to just close with this little story. This happened about 3 years ago. And I had this thing come up, and I was super nervous about addressing it. And I was talking to an old timer in AA, and it's one of those things where you always got to be careful when you're talking to old timers, because they've got some sort of Jedi mind tricks that they play on you. And I was a couple years sober, and I was telling him about how nervous I was about what was coming up. And he said, well, Jon, he goes, let me ask you this. He said, do you trust God today? And I looked at him. I said, man, I absolutely trust God today. Look at the past 2 years of my life. How could I not? And then he just smiled and he said, well, what the hell are you so worried about? God already knows how this is going to go. Just show up. And that was it. And so today in my life, that's what I'm trying to do, is like, what am I so worried about? God already knows how this is going to go. My job is to show up and bring him with me. I went a couple minutes over. I hope that's okay. I'm sorry, Justin. I've got a tendency to be overly verbose, but I was trying to be cognizant of time. So that's kind of what I have up until this point, and I'm open for any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jon. I love your vulnerability and willingness to share on this topic that you said, hey, I'm having a hard time with this right now. It's driven by 100 forms of fear, controlled by. I totally relate to that. And I'm going to jump in with just a little bit of my own experience that I've recently gone through. I went through the steps initially back in 2013, 2014, and did my step 4 inventory. And when I got to the fears, I told my sponsor, I'm not afraid of anything. I'm a man, I can handle anything. And he kind of laughed at me and said, well, let me ask you a couple questions. And, oh yeah, I'm afraid of that. Okay, here we go. That gives you a start. I recently, just in the last 6 months, did another journey through the steps, and did a new step 4. And when I hit that fear tab, that fear inventory, I was shocked at how much fear was driving me. And this is, 9 years into my recovery journey. I suddenly am able to see more clearly the fear. So thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate that. So we've got some questions that have come in from the live audience, and a reminder to the live audience, if you have a question for Jon, please type it in the Q&A link at the bottom of the window. We'll ask those and of him, and get his input and his experience, strength, and hope on those. I've also got some questions here that I've written down. Okay, we'll start with Maddie. Maddie says, often my fear is buried underneath irritability and anger. How do you use the tools of the program, prayer, and meditation to identify your fears? And thanks for your honesty, is what Maddie says.
Well, hi, Maddie. That's a good question, because usually that's where I find that my fears are too. And so on page 66 of the big book, I had to remind myself of this a lot initially. And it says that anger is the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics, these things are poison. It tells me that I have to be free of that if I'm to live. And if I kind of bounce around in the books a little bit. So my answer comes from a couple of the books, but in the 12 by 12, in step 10, there's a part where it talks about the spiritual axiom, and it says it is a spiritual axiom that whenever we are disturbed, no matter what the cause, there is something wrong with us. And so, what recovery's given me is the opportunity to actually recognize when these things come up, recognize like, okay, I am disturbed. And it doesn't matter what's causing it on the outside, but look at what's inside of me that is disturbed. Now, um, the other thing that that tells me kind of implicitly is that now I have the tools to get myself undisturbed. And what I've found is that oftentimes the world around me doesn't need to change the things that I'm angry at if the way I look at them changes. I have people, and I deal with people in early recovery a lot, and it's an interesting thing just watching people come in and just slam their heads into the wall. You feel like if you're old enough, if you've seen the movie Parenthood, where the little kid puts the bucket on his head and just starts running into the wall, you kind of get that impression with newcomers. And one of the things that I've done so that I don't get as irritable, I can, like, love and tolerance is our code, and that's a choice we make. And if I'm going to approach them with love and tolerance, I kind of picture them in hospital gowns. I do these little things that allow me to get undisturbed. I picture them like somehow they're out in the world, but our minds get so sick. The book tells us we get so warped that when I'm able to ask for help, and I ask for it with prayer and meditation, and it tells us when we have resentments or when we have fears, we put them on paper. So I will do that and journal that, and then I ask for help. And oftentimes the help is, let me be willing to see this a different way. And I've been married 25 years, and I'm going to tell you, it's not always easy. And sometimes I will be pretty resentful, and I will think, okay, you know what? I can't believe my wife's doing this. And I'm trying to look at my part of it. And I'm like, well, my part's maybe 5%. Like, do I actually owe an amends for the 5%? Like, because I'm angry. And what I do is I'll hit my knees, and I won't ask to make the amends. I'll ask for the willingness to do it, because it is a program of willingness. And every day that I have done that, I have not gone to bed before making the amends. And by the time I do it, I see more of my part. And so for me, I don't know if that helps with the answer, but it's like, when I'm disturbed, when I'm angry, when I am anxious, when I am irritable, there's something with me that needs to be looked at. It's not with the other people outside of me. And what I do is I've learned how to address that. And with time, I get better at it.
Thank you, Jon. I appreciate that. We have another, this is a comment, but I'm going to turn it into a question because I can put myself in these shoes and ask this question. This comes in from BJ. BJ says, "Hi, Jon. Thank you for sharing. My mom has stage 4 brain cancer and is getting chemo. You give hope. Bless you." What a scary place to be for an individual who, in your shoes, you have been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. In this person's shoes, where a loved one is. You were not in a place where you were working your recovery when you had that experience. But now, as you are in recovery, how would you address the fears of that differently than maybe you did previously?
Well, I've seen people in recovery do that, and who've come in with stage 4 cancer, and who've walked through it with like a grace and integrity that I will tell you I did not have at the time. And I know that grace and integrity in the way that they are walking through that and handling that is coming from something much larger than them. And so I have this interesting thing, this process that I go through when these things come up. And I realize that I can't change what's going on in the events and what's happened. But the way that I handle that differently, and so this was like, I'll use the example of when my wife's younger brother passed away, who was like, he had lived with us. I mean, we were family. Is my thought at that time became, how can I be of maximum service to him? how can I be of maximum service to the people who are hurting, suffering, the people in the struggle? And I have this belief that, and I don't know if this will help BJ, but this is my belief, is that we don't give God a lot of room to work with us when we're angry, when we're resentful, when we're mad. But my experience has been is that when we're like down, when we're feeling sorrow, God lifts us. And it's once I got through the anger and the resentment, and luckily for me, that I worked through that within just minutes of this. And when I found out, and just through the sorrow, I felt lifted. And what that did is it allowed me to go and be of service to the people around me. And I've seen people who have struggled with stage 4 cancer in the rooms, in recovery, and I've watched how much service they've done, and I've just watched the ways that they have been lifted, and it's inspirational. But I'm sorry to hear that. I know that life gets heavy. I've got this other little philosophy. I don't think God's the author of our pain, but I think he's willing to be a co-participant in it with us if we ask him.
Thank you, Jon. And yes, BJ, our prayers are with you, your mom. We hope that
absolutely
that whatever God's will is happens, but that it brings you and others closer to God and to your mom. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. All right. I have a question here from Ken. Ken says, thanks for your courage and transparency. I know you touched on this, but please share more about it. Do you get stuck with being a human doing? In other words, how do you deal with it's up to me to figure it out? Then I'll be ready. And that goes back to what you talked about. Hey, if I know something, I better do something about it, basically.
Yeah. Justin, I can't remember if I discussed this when I was on the last podcast, but what AA has given me is a new life philosophy. And what life used to be, and this is probably a perfect analogy for the whole fear thing, is that life used to be this really complicated game of chess where I would sit and I would figure out what move to make, and then how people would respond, and then how I would have to respond. And I always tried to be like 3 moves ahead. And it was just heavy and it was complicated. And it wasn't until I was 43 years old that I realized I'm not any good at chess. And what I do now, and I don't know if this answers the question, but I'll tell you the way I approach it, is that I show up and I'm just simply playing checkers. I'm doing whatever's in front of me to be done. I'm making plans as I'm expected to. I scrub my motives before I go into things. So I make sure that I'm being honest, that I'm not in self-pity, that I don't have self-seeking motives. I go through this process and then I just do what's in front of me to be done. And I ask for help in the process. And so for me, usually the times that, that when I don't want to go to a meeting, when I just want to stay home and isolate, are the times where I need to actually go do something. Some mornings, I start my mornings in prayer and meditation. And my first sponsor told me before he had moved, and what he had told me, I had one day where I was really busy and I was just out there, solving all the problems in my life at 60 days sober. Like, it was a great thing for me to do. And he said, well, man, make sure you're taking your higher power with you. And I thought, oh, crap, Bill, I didn't even pray this morning. And he said, well, our book says on awakening, but he said, you can actually start your day over anytime and do that. And he said, let me tell you my advice. And it just hit me a little differently when I heard it. As he said, why don't you spend 15 to 20 minutes every morning in prayer and meditation? He said, unless you have a really busy day like you have right now. And he goes, then spend an hour. And I thought, oh my gosh, like usually my busy days, I've got to wake up early for, I've got to do all these other things. And I would say since hearing that in the past 5 years, there's maybe been 3 days that I have not spent 15 minutes in prayer and meditation. And I still remember those days. I still remember how bad those days went for me. But the beautiful part of it was that I was taught that I could take my higher power with me. And then I can start my day over at any time. So I remembered, I mean, sometimes I had to start it over 3 times before we hit noon. Just hit my knees. Okay, you know what? Need a new day. Let's just start over and approach it. And then I just do whatever's in front of me to be done. And that involves working with people, that involves being of service, that involves hitting meetings. But like the interesting thing, because this little poem, and then I'll stop on this one, but it was in the Grapevine years ago, and it's a poem that makes complete sense to me because it said, I sought myself and could not see. I sought my God and he eluded me. And I sought my brother and I found all three. And if I want God to show up more in my life, I need to be willing to go out and just be of service to his kids.
I love that poem. Thank you for bringing that back to front of mind. Good stuff. And thanks for sharing that. You shared earlier that, hey, you had moved to Vegas and you thought, well, maybe Vegas is the problem. I'm not getting any better here. Let's move back to Utah. Let's make a geographic change for sobriety and healing and see if this works. And that wasn't the issue. Talk a little bit more about, the propensity or the tendency that that you have, that I have, that, others have to run away from things rather than face them up. And why is it important to face those fears where they are and address them if possible?
Yeah, let me tell you kind of the path that my mind goes here, and you can tell me if you need me to elaborate more and actually address it. But this restless, irritable, and discontent part of this disease comes on to me at any time, and it will manifest itself in different ways. One way is like, hey, Jon, maybe you need a new car. Maybe you need to maybe the reason you're not happy and so uncomfortable is because you need a new Audi and that's important for you, or something like that. And then if I go and get something new and I get it and I bring it into my clutches, and about a week into it, I realize that, you know what, got exactly what I wanted, but I think I got the wrong color. And I know I'm in the middle of my disease, and sometimes it's a car, sometimes it's a job, sometimes it's moving. But what it is I'm not addressing the things internally. And so it's wherever I'm at, like, again, it's that whole spiritual axiom. It's like whenever I'm disturbed, no matter what the cause, there's something wrong with me. But I have spent, 40 years of my life looking to solve that by things on the outside. I told you my education, and it's not to build up my ego. It's like, if you hear how educated I am and the path I took, hopefully you're looking back thinking, man, this guy's way overeducated for his level of intelligence. Like, this idiot somehow just went and got all these degrees. But I did that because I couldn't figure out how to address those things internally. And so I know that when I'm on this scavenger hunt or this wild goose chase for happiness in this outside world, that's where things are amiss. And so sometimes that's a demographic move. So where I will move from Vegas to Salt Lake City, but unfortunately it brought me with me, and that was the problem. It wasn't Las Vegas. And I think of all these things on the outside, but what that does is that gives me an opportunity to look inward. That gives me an opportunity, and that's usually a good opportunity for me to go through the steps or to do like a step 10 inventory with my sponsor, where it's that half year one that they talk about, where you can sit down and go through these things. And it allows me to get right with this. And it allows me to seek the help and guidance, because I'm so compartmentalized. Sometimes I don't even know I'm doing it. I don't even know that, I don't even realize it's like after the fact, I'm looking back thinking, oh, really? Wait, I'm pretty good when I look at my life in hindsight, but in the moment, I may not be the best decision maker. I don't know if that answers it, but that's kind of where my mind went with the question.
I love it. And I loved the phrase, the problem is wherever I go, I take me with me.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. I've got to fix me, or I've got to have me fixed. If I'm going to find peace, no matter where I am, whether that's in Vegas or Salt Lake or with the new job or the new car or wherever it may be, whatever it may be that I'm seeking that peace or that satisfaction from, that's outside of that. And I think this jumps into this next comment that was sent by Pete. This isn't a question, but I'm going to state the comment, and I think we'll get something from it. Pete B says, at 34 years clean, I was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. Initially, I went to the dark side, and while I didn't use, I stayed in a dark, confused place with it until I ran into a couple of people who were dealing with as bad or worse health conditions. And I turned back to spiritual principles and found immediate relief from the darkness. Ultimately, I was also relieved of the tumor. Just went away on its own. The doctor couldn't explain what happened medically. But hard to talk about this at first, but learn to just report what happened and let people come to whatever conclusion that might want to. And I just thank him. Your story really moves me. Thanks for sharing this. So where I want to go with that, well, actually, Jon, is there anything in there that jumped out at you that you'd like to make comments on before I?
Oh, I relate to it in such a huge way. So I see my oncologist every 6 months. And I'm going to tell you the reason I see my oncologist is because I was re-diagnosed with cancer a couple of years ago. And it has been the most interesting thing because I went in and I sat down with my oncologist, and he called me in about 2 years ago, and it was right after blood work. And usually that always means something's amiss. And before I'd gotten sober, I was a guy who had, his blood pressure was always 160 over 105, like through the roof. And I went in there for that appointment, and my blood pressure, I still remember, was like 105 over 78, like real calm, real at peace. And I met with him, and what the doctor wanted to ask me about was what I was doing in my life. Sorry, it's kind of humbling because it's not anything I've done. It's what God's done for me. But what I'm doing in my life to be as present and as fit and as emotionally well as I was like when he called me in. And he said, if there's a way I could give that to all of my patients, they would be fine. And then he pulled me aside and he just said, man, if you keep doing what you're doing, I'm going to tell you something. He goes, you will die with cancer, but you will not die from it. Like, it's not growing, it's not going anywhere. It's just there, but it does not seem to have any effect on your system. And I thought, I left and I could not believe what a huge God I have in my life that would just allow me to walk through something so big in a way with such serenity. And to a point now where, like, I tell people I worry more about cancer than I worry about, like, whether my socks match. And most days I'm either in flip-flops or Vans, and I don't think I've worn socks all summer. So it's one of those things where I'm not giving it any attention, but man, what you're saying, I understand. And I contrast that to where I was back in, 2003, where my world fell apart. I didn't know how to address it. I didn't know how to talk to anyone about it. I even remember coming home from the first doctor's appointment thinking I was dying. And my wife asked me what the doctor had said. And she was 7 months pregnant with twins and so anxious. And I lied to her. And I said, oh, doctor said we're going to be fine. Like, I couldn't even address things for me, where now I get to be this honest and transparent person. And I don't say that in a bragging way. I say that in a way of just total humility, because I never was. But I actually get to be a guy who's honest today. And that, to me, that is just such a gift. It's one of those things I don't take for granted, but there's spiritual principles to all of that. And I think that when we live in that, we don't know what our life's going to look like. And my little belief on that is that it's actually none of my business. That's his business. That's God's business. My business is to show up, to do what's in front of me to be done, and leave the results up to him. Because it always will work out better than my mind tells me.
Love it. Thank you. We have one more comment, and then I'll ask you a final question before we go into closing out here. The one more comment is from Lynette. She says, thank you for your share. I'm in 12-step for CODA, sex and love, and listening to your share, I relate still on so many levels. Appreciate your vulnerability and honesty with us. So, and I echo that. I've found so much peace for myself in seeing that addiction is the same. Recovery is the same. The spiritual principles are the same. No matter what fellowship I'm a part of, I gain experience, strength, and hope from you, Jon, and others who share your experience, strength, and hope. Thank you.
Yeah, now, I agree. We have one solution, right? Like, doesn't matter the program, one solution.
Yep. All right. So before we close out, do you have any final words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us, Jon?
I don't know if I have any wisdom, but the thing that comes to mind for me at this point is that I remember the struggle I had with approaching the steps. And I had a little brother who's 9 years sober, and he helped me get into this process 4 years ago. And he was so loving and so tolerant and so patient. And one of the things he told me before doing it, which really just got me thinking, and I couldn't tell if it was a compliment or not, said, "Man, you might be too smart for recovery." But he goes, "You were definitely too stupid to stay sober." And I couldn't figure out if he was giving me a compliment or not. But what that's come to mean for me is that it's not figuring it out. It's taking the action and seeing the results that happen in your life as a result of that action. I struggled with step 3. I really struggled initially with step 3 because I thought I knew what God was and what it needed to be and all these kind of things. And my sponsor pulled me aside and he said, "Jon," he goes, "I need you to change the wording in step 3 to made a decision to turn my will in my life over the care of God as I don't understand him." And he goes, "Because whether you think you understand God or not doesn't matter." He goes, "The thing that matters is that you realize that God could and would if he were sought." And he said, "Jon, be a seeker." And I, for 5 years, have been a seeker. And I will tell you today, I have a huge God in my life that has somehow got me through all these things that have happened, that it takes care of my family, that takes care, he's my employer, he's all these things. And I don't know if I understand this God at all, but I don't need to, because the thing that I know with a certainty, because I can feel this, is that this God understands me. And I get to walk through this world with peace that I've never had before. I get to walk through it with a sense of comfort, and I get to walk through it in a way that I've never been able to. And so if you're trying to figure it out, instead of figuring, maybe just start seeking. Take the action and do it, because that was the thing that helped me the most. I don't know if I spoke too long there, but that was the one thing that came to mind.
Beautiful. I want to stand up and shout hooray. Hallelujah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jon. That was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. Please consider joining our private Facebook group. The link is in the show notes, in the podcast, and in the chat of the live meeting. And participate in our community, asking questions and answering others' questions that may come up. If you have not yet rated and reviewed the podcast to our audience in Apple Podcasts, please go do so now. It's a great way to help us work our 12th step and for you to work your 12th step and sharing the message with others. I invite the audience to come back next week when we will be hearing from Scott H., who is on fire in his own recovery walk. And he'll be speaking to us on his experience, strength, and hope of finally getting it after 40 years in the rooms. I'm excited to hear this. Now, let's launch off into the rest of our day with the serenity prayer that Jon will say for us.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Amen. Keep coming back, everybody. Come trudge this happy road with me. Work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight. Still searching for glimmers of light. Feet still on the ground, I can still be found. Standing still.
My wings are torn and tattered, but I know I still can fly. I may not soar unfettered, I may not rise too high.
Recorded in the book of life and bind it with the seal